Welcome, friends. This is our second and first full lecture related to American government. First lecture was really an intro to the course, the intro to the study of politics, and I hope that you feel prepared to engage in what I think is going to be an exciting, wonderful journey. Today we're going to look at the sources of politics and the sources of government, and we're going to really try to answer four questions when it comes to politics. What is it? What is its background? What does it encompass? And perhaps most importantly for you as a college student, how does it influence me? So we're going to look at what it is, what is its background, what does it encompass, and how does it influence me? We want to begin by examining and pondering the difference between politics on one side and government on the other. They are not the same. They're two different concepts, two different realities that we have to come to terms with. First of all, let's look at politics. One way to think about politics is it is a process. It's how we start at point A and end at point B. The classic example in American politics is how a law is made. Now, what happens in that process is sometimes not pretty. In fact, the German philosopher Hegel once said that the making of laws is like the making of sausage. Now, that's a analogy that's sometimes lost on us in the 21st century because we think sausage comes directly from McDonald's or Burger King or wherever we might go to grab at the grocery store. But the making of laws is a very difficult process. For example, if we talk about something that affects you directly, student financial aid, someone in Congress has to have the idea that student financial aid needs to be increased. That person introduces a bill, it goes through the whole process in the House and the Senate. Both houses have to pass the bill. Then it has to go to the president has to consider it, the president has to sign it into law, and then eventually it becomes available, that additional money and additional support for you, the American student. That's a long process. That can sometimes take years for a certain idea to come into being. But that is our process as a democratic form of government. That's how we make decisions. On the other hand, that's politics. On the other hand, government is the institutions where these decisions are made. For example, the United States Congress is part of the government. It is an institution. The presidency that we'll be studying later, as well with Congress, is an institution, as is the Supreme Court. Another type of institution would be the bureaucracy that would carry out this student financial aid decision. There are international governmental institutions like the United Nations, like certain bodies of the United Nations, some regional groups as well, like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that's the difference between politics and government. Let's now go back and talk about politics. Well, what is politics? There are a number of ways of defining it. It can be, potentially, not always, it can be a moral activity. It can lead us to a common, higher understanding and resolving of issues. There are many examples one might offer, but ending slavery, for example, in the 19th century was in large part a political process. Many of the most divisive issues in American politics, whether it be immigration or abortion, have a moral element. So politics is inevitably involved in moral questions. Politics is also an economic activity. Most American business relations, dealings, and the like are regulated by government. Most economic activity is regulated by government. I know that's hard to believe that when you go and buy a cheeseburger, that it is regulated in some way. Why don't they just throw a cheeseburger on the grill and present it to you, and you pay your part? Well, almost every aspect of that food production, from the growing from the manufacturing, processing, selling. All that is regulated by government. Government has a hand in almost all of economic activity. Also, politics deals with values, like morals, how we make decisions, what our priorities are, which leads us to a very funny statement that's often made that we can't legislate morality. The reality is that government legislates morality all the time in very different ways, and we may not always agree with those ways. Now, in thinking about politics, we also need to keep in mind that some Americans have very set ideas about politics. We call those who have very established, well thought out ideas about politics that are usually comprehensive in nature. We call that an ideology. Most Americans do not have an ideology. Most Americans do not have a firm set of political beliefs. Okay, now we're turning to the next area of our discussion, and that's the background of our political system, what we might call the evolution of our political ideas. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this subject in the course of this semester's class. But for the moment, let's keep in mind that the study of politics and the study of government is a very ancient pursuit. In ancient Greece, for example, and even before that point, great commentators on politics, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, talked about what's the best kind of government, what's the government that best represents the needs of the country. The notion of state or government is one of the oldest concerns for academic study. If you look to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, even older text, there is a natural need for some form of government. And when there isn't government, or the wrong type of government, or government doesn't operate very effectively, you can have all sorts of problems. The study of government, or the study of politics, has taken many forms over many, many years, which it makes it we're not starting out anew. We're basing our study of the semester on a lot of insight that came before us, which really brings us as well to the purpose of this introductory course to American government. Part of that mission is to introduce you to the voices of the past that have informed our understanding of politics today. Accordingly, we also need to look at the fundamental problems and the fundamental opportunities of American politics. Another task is to alert you to the kinds of issues that are most pressing today in American politics and will be most pressing during your lifetime. And that forms a very exciting part of this class. And as we begin that study of the nature of American politics, American government, American political institutions, we need to keep in mind that there are two major paradigms in American political science for examining politics. The older tradition is what we call the normative tradition. That's a fancy word that basically means we look at the big ideas of how government has evolved, how government functions. As you'll see soon, in a few moments, that's what we call what should be, what ought to be. This is the oldest approach to political thinking. We usually associate this type approach that bases the theory of government and politics upon what should be the best form of government. We usually associate with the great political thinker and theorist Plato. And Plato in ancient Greece, dealing fundamentally with a small political system, as we will talk about in a few moments. On the other hand, the opposing and now really kind of the reigning view of how we should study politics is what we call the empirical view. Give me the facts. What are the facts? So on one hand, you have the normative view about what ought to be. On the other hand, you have the empirical view, the facts. The facts are the empirical view suggests look at government the way it is now. What is government doing? How can that be changed? If James Brown is the godfather of soul, and that Plato is the godfather of the normative approach, then the godfathers of the empirical approach would be Aristotle, specifically his great book, The Politics, that surveys 158 constitutions in ancient Greece, and said, let's look at these and see what we can find from these 158 constitutions that can work best. What can we salvage from all these ideas and all these experiments in government? And the other sort of godfather of the empirical school would be Machiavelli, the great Italian thinker, and his idea of what you have to do to make government work, to stay in power, to survive in politics. So we have, when we begin to look at politics, the normative versus the empirical view of how we come to understand what political institutions and government and politics is all about. In the 21st century, we discuss politics as usually political science. We use the term science. Most political scientists in the 21st century use the scientific method coming out of the Enlightenment as a kind of inspiration for their analysis and how they think about politics and government. In American political science, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s, we had what was called the behaviorist revolution. Is that those who take an empirical perspective began to dominate the study of American politics and American institutions. And that dominance continues today. Scholars who assume that approach, and they represent the majority, and it certainly influences our class, and on a personal note, it has influenced me, they spend a great deal of time using scientific method, not particularly as they do in the biology lab, the chemistry lab, but scientific method applied to the study of politics and political institutions. Now, that doesn't mean that they're without bias. That's their ultimate goal, is to be without bias, but that's not necessarily the case. Bias makes its way in many regards. We're going to talk about that, especially when we come to look at public opinion. Also, a fundamental assumption and challenge is the realization that we're studying the most complex being that has ever been created, the human, and the human's participation in politics. And it's very hard to make too many comprehensive claims in that pursuit. And also, given the relationship of politics and values, sometimes science doesn't help us in that process of sorting out values.